Look, of course, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land and pay my respects to all those past and present, and acknowledge any Indigenous people here today. And I want to segue that into something that my federal colleague, Tony Burke, who we share the same area, I'm the state member for Lakemba and he's the federal member for Watson. So Tony and I work quite closely together, very similar-minded in terms of many things, especially when it comes to race and culture and religion and, you know, the importance of what we bring through our diversity to Australia. And one of the things that we often talk about is that there are only 2 Australian stories. There's 26 million stories, but really, there's only 2 Australian stories. There's the Indigenous story, with that very first dawn of mankind on this land, and every other story post that is also a migrant story. So whether you arrived last week, or whether you arrived up to 60,000 years ago, or whether you arrived in a boat 200 and something years ago, everything is about migration. So as far as I'm concerned, Australia is actually there for everybody. And for those who say, you know, go back to where you came from, well, we'd all go back to somewhere, no matter who we are, no matter where we come from. And so I think that point is really an important one to make, that we are a migrant nation. And it doesn't mean migration started at the end of World War II. We've always been a migrant nation. And really, the only people who can lay claim to being the first migrants are our Indigenous brothers and sisters. And so let's recognise that. Now, Noah has covered a great deal of things. I jotted down a few notes as he was talking about some things that I'd like to talk about. And you have a very academic and a much deeper reason for it. I think it gives me a very good intro to some things that I want to talk about. And I'm also conscious of the fact that I don't want to talk for too long, because I think the really important thing, the thing that I know Noah and I would love to do, is to make sure that this is an interactive thing. It's a two-way. If you want to hear me talk, it's pretty easy. You just sort of switch on to something and you'll hear me talk about stuff that's probably not that important to you. But it's always the same. And I thought the fact that you talked about the racism show that was on SBS the other day, that was one of the things that I did want to mention. You've spoken about the lady with the niqab, but I thought the other one that was really interesting was the young Indigenous man who was given a job. That there were 2. It was a little experiment. So there was an Indigenous man and a non-Indigenous man, probably about 20, say. A bike that was chained up. The non-Indigenous man, both of them given a hacksaw to hack into the chain. Now, with the non-Indigenous person, but clearly white person, people were just, you know, a bit of a quizzical look, but they kind of just accepted it. It was okay. With the Indigenous fellow, not only were people looking in a much more suspicious manner, but the way that he was then treated. Before, he wasn't, you know, someone didn't come up and ask him, the security came up and asked him, hey, what are you doing? Somebody came up from behind, grabbed him from the neck, put him to the ground, and put the knee in the back. That's what racism is. And that is institutionalised racism. The fact that we can see one person doing the exact same thing, but as soon as he changes skin colour to another, it elicits a different response, that rings alarm bells. And it was just one of many things. And of course, some of it was set up because it wants to see people's reactions. But I actually thought the program explored who we are as Australians, and I think at this point in time, it's a really important narrative. Who are we? And what are we? Because my grandfather didn't fight on the Anzac Code. My dad didn't fight in Vietnam. My uncle didn't go and fight, along the Kokoda track. So does that mean that Anzac spirit, that spirit of mateship and endurance and sacrifice, is something that I can't belong to because they didn't have that fight? Well, no, because that's the endearing Australian spirit. And that moment that my parents chose to come to Australia because they needed shelter, that was the moment that they laid down their hands onto our Constitution and said, from this point on, this is our country. Not because they didn't get to fight in the war, because I don't have the blue eyes and the blonde hair, or because I don't fly the Australian flag in my front yard. For them, as it is for me, it's about the spirit. It's about those values. I often hear about Australian values. You know what? They're actually universal values. They're good values. I get sick and tired of being told Australian values. So does that mean that they're only exclusive to you because you're Australian? Well, what is Australian? I've got my citizenship, I've got my passport, it's Australian. Does that make me a less Australian than somebody who can trace back their heritage 3, 4, 5 generations, way back to the First Fleet? Does that make them Australian and me non-Australian? Or does it make us Australian, but with different cultural heritages? My dad and mum brought me here when I was 2 years of age. And it was to escape a war. So Australia gave us shelter. Had we not come to Australia, I wouldn't be standing here. I would not have been, had we stayed in Lebanon, a member of parliament. Because we don't have over there that egalitarian society that we do in Australia. We don't have the opportunity that we do in Australia. When those soldiers fought in World War I, they didn't fight for racism and bigotry. They actually fought so the future generations can have the opportunities that we do now. Not just so that one particular group can have them. So they came here, and you try and talk to my dad. And I often talk about my dad. I say my dad's my hero. My dad, he left school when he was 10 years of age, not because he wanted to, but because he had to, because his father fell ill and he was the eldest son. He had to leave school and go and work. And he used to sell chewing gum, run errands, sandwich hand. And yet my dad is one of the smartest people that I know. And he's the reason that we value education so much. He drilled in us the very importance of that. And it's the same story that many migrants will tell you, their mother and father. They came here, they worked in factories. My mum worked 2 jobs. And then at night would do whatever she could to help us at home. They worked and they worked and they worked. And they never for a moment forgot to be thankful for what they were given. The opportunity to live a life, not for them, but for their children. And so when I took my oath in Parliament, it was actually an emotional moment for me. But I looked up and I saw my mum and dad. And that was actually the thing that really brought me to tears. And during my speech, I couldn't look at Dad or Mum because I knew that I'd start crying. And I don't want to be known as a sookie babe. You can't go into Parliament and start crying when you first go. You know, there's nothing wrong with no emotion anyway, mind you. Those are the experiences though that shape people. Now I was lucky; I had good experiences. We were called all sorts of names. Like you, I never got the clag paste in the sandwich.
You missed out.
I know I missed out because what I would do is on my way to school, I would actually throw my food away. I would actually throw it away because I was too embarrassed. Because it would smell funny, because it was a bit different. And I was saying earlier to Peter and to Noah, I actually just wanted a Vegemite sandwich. That's all I wanted. You know, I mean, a Vegemite sandwich is that, you know, they look, you're too skinny and all this sort of thing. You know, apparently I still am too skinny. But it was really funny that at that time I wanted to do it. I was telling the guys the story earlier about my daughter, who's 13, for her birthday. All she wanted was my mother to make her a whole pot of vine leaves. That was what she wanted as her birthday present. And for the last week and a half, she's been taking a little ration every single day to school. And I just laughed. I said to my wife, I would have got bashed for doing that at school. You know, how different our world is. But it isn't all just about food, and it isn't all just about culture. This is about the Australia that we want. I'm preaching to the converted here, but our Australia, and I've said this over and over again, is actually made better because of the differences that we have. Because every single person brings a different thread to that fabric. It could be a different colour, it could be a different religion, it could be a different, value system, it could be a different heritage. Everybody brings something. And when we put all that together, if it's done right, it actually creates this beautiful society where we don't tolerate one another, we actually respect one another, and we appreciate one another, and we value one another. I'm not asking you to tolerate me, I'm asking you to accept me in the same way that I will accept you, in the same way that everybody accepts somebody else. Because when we travel overseas, when I travel overseas, I put on the thickest Aussie accent you can imagine. I start using the phrases like cobber, mate, g'day, start stretching it out as much as I can. And when I was in the United States a little while ago, once I got over the shock of my name, they worked out, that's another story. They worked out that I was Australian. And then of course, where are you from? Australia. But where are you from? Australia. Well, whereabouts? Sydney. They just want to dig a bit deeper and go, Australia, everybody is Australian, and that's the really important thing. A couple of weeks ago, we had a day off from Parliament, we're back in the electorate office, so Parliament wasn't sitting. But there was an inquiry into 18C. And 18C is very, very topical at the moment. The report was delivered yesterday, I think, yesterday or the day before. It was handed down. Now, I'm passionate about diversity, I'm passionate about multiculturalism, I'm passionate about everybody having the right to say things. I'm for free speech. But free speech doesn't mean that you say things that are actually going to be offensive, they're going to be insightful, and then you use that as an example. We want to talk about free speech. I love that the people who talk about free speech are the first ones to say, well, people don't have a right to have a freedom to wear what they want to wear. What a ridiculous argument. Yeah, you can have free speech, and I'm fighting for it, but I'm also fighting that somebody else can't have freedom of expression. You know, you can't have it both sort of ways. Anyway, I went into the Parliament, and I wanted to listen because I was doing a hearing in Sydney and I wanted to listen in. And so I listened to group after group after group, telling the same story. Proud Australians, different heritages, different religions, different cultures, different colours. It all rang the same all the way through. I am Australian, but sometimes people don't see me as being Australian. And sometimes people treat me in a way that's not fair. This is with the protection of 18C. What in God's name? What more can they say? What more can they say to take it away? Why would you take away something that, if with the protections of it at the moment, this is what's going on? What more could they possibly have to say? Other than to be able just to let completely loose. And there was an argument there that, there's only been an X number of cases, or there were some vexatious charges that were brought. Well, streamline that, fix that. You don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, because at least if I were never ever to use the Anti-Discrimination Act, at least I know that it's there. At least that may be a deterrent for one person who wants to say something that is going to be offensive, that is going to be insightful. Hey, we're thick-skinned. Nobody is can't stand anything being said. I think there's got to be a bit of a robust discussion. But if you've ever been on the receiving end of harassment because of your background or because of your difference, then you know the difference between somebody jokingly calling you a wog and somebody calling you a wog. There's a big, big difference, and you don't know it unless you've been on the receiving end of it. You know when people are being patronising, you know when people are making fun of you, you know when people look at you a bit differently, and as if it came almost on cue. A couple of days ago, I just happened to be walking past a group of people, and there was a thick accent, probably, you know, European style accent, and all I heard was this conversation. I just caught, you know, maybe a completely different context. I just heard them say, you know what I really don't like about the Asians? They don't even speak English. And I thought, mate, have you even heard your accent? Can you just stop for a moment? And so I couldn't help myself, you know, because I think if you walk past that, then you're allowing it to happen and you're encouraging it to take place. And I just said, excuse me, sir, I think you're way out of line. And I just kept walking. And I mean, I didn't, you know, do any more than that, but it needed to be said. And I thought, here's the irony. Here's somebody who came here that would have been subjected to racism themselves potentially once. And now they're actually perpetuating it. And for what? Because they don't speak English. These generalisations, which then raises the other big issue of me about annoyance with generalisations. Look, I've got heaps. I've only got to the first point.
You've got a big
but I want to probably finish off on that point and just go a little bit further about the role that everybody plays. So we've got people in the public square now who think it's okay to just blurt out. The problem is opinion has become fact. And people talk in generalisations. Oh, that group, those people, what they're doing is they're framing the other. They're framing an us and them. In a great Australian modern multicultural nation, there is no us and them. There is actually a we. Because every one of us is a contributor to this society. But when you keep framing people in a negative light, when you keep generalising, when you keep saying those, then it does change. And I will say one thing from that show, and it was a big shock for me, this is the SBS show, was the attitude. the attitude towards Muslims, say, from 20 years ago to now. It's got a lot more negative, so we can't say it doesn't exist. And that's not, I'm not saying that because I'm a Muslim person, I'm saying that because it's a really obvious thing, because I will get people coming into my office telling me, and especially women, and I think you're a massive coward if you think that you can big note yourself with a woman. Women who are being spat at, women who are criticised for what they wear, women who are abused because they choose to follow their belief, women who are tormented, and yet this is something that, with the protection of 18C, is going on. What do you do when you take that away? But the important thing is that we don't respond to every single thing. You'll hear some things that are really out there. We can't respond to every single thing because it's kind of like just to hook you in every single time. But we also can't let it go. And we can't just take it for granted. And we can't say, oh, that's okay, that's just a person who's, like a little bit off centre. Well, the problem is that little person off centre, give them a microphone, give them a platform, becomes 2, becomes 3, becomes 4. Then this discussion that ever used to happen, and people go, hang on a second, this is not a right discussion to have, it becomes normal. And that's sort of a bit more what we're seeing. We're seeing with the advent of, whether it's social media, or whether it's the constant news cycle, everyone's become a journalist. People just whack up their phone, record it, and then say something. And that's it. And unfortunately, this is what I mean by that idea of opinion becoming fact. And what makes knowledge and what makes a success is when people actually take the time to get to know one another. Now, not one group is to blame, but this is where I think a bit of leadership comes in. And the leadership is to say this very same point that I started with. Who are we? Who are we as Australians? What are we as a nation? What are we as a people? What are our hopes? What are our dreams? And what are our aspirations? And our hopes and dreams and aspirations do not exclude groups. Because when we involve everybody, when everybody feels that they are part of that great Australian narrative, then we don't doubt whether people are loyal or not. We don't doubt that people are different. Difference is fine. But what we do is we send a very strong message that it doesn't matter. All that matters is that we're all working together to make this and continue to be the greatest nation on earth. That is all that matters. And the difference that you bring, that's actually not a weakness. That doesn't take away from our country. That actually strengthens our country. That makes our country better. Because we, as a model across the world, are a perfect example of what modern multiculturalism is, what respect is, and what value for the other is. But we can't have that when we've got one group that says, this is what it means to be Australian, and all of you people who don't fit, you're sort of Australian. There is no sort of Australian and Australian. We're all Australian. And I'll leave it at that.